Okay, hi everyone, and unless I'm surprised by some other duty, it looks like I'll be able to do another program today. Won't be a long one, probably. And I sent out already to you program number 29. And now this is program 30, and we're beginning with Discipleship in the New Age, Volume 1, Section 1. There are 3 great sections in this book. And Part 7, we're still on Part 7, video commentary. This is the 17th of August, 2021. And you may remember that we've been dealing somewhat with the idea of telepathy and how it is the master works with the soul of the chela and the soul, the group soul of the groups he has gathered. As a little segue, I might say this, and I'm simply reading what Master DK has said. The fact, however, that one group will work with one type of force and another group of disciples will employ a different kind, and may I add, probably ray energy and maybe some astrological factors. But this fact, anyway, that another group of disciples will employ a different kind must not, he says, in any sense be deemed to indicate separate activity or separative interests. Let me say and remind us all that the one great heresy, as far as occultism is concerned, is the great heresy of separateness. And when we overcome the distinctions which the recalcitrant lower mind seems to make, then that illusion of separateness will be overcome. So all the members of all these groups, when one day, may I say, the Seed Group Project has reached fruition, all will be working towards one objective or goal, and all will work with the same divine energy. And notice, please, the word energy, and he goes on to say that energy, it is differentiated, he says, into varying forces for the purpose of service in one department of life or another. Let me say, all of this is about the service we can render, and render more successfully if we will follow the advice he gives on the methods of spiritual occultism, spiritual esotericism. DK goes on to say, I would ask you to ponder deeply upon the various aspects of the outlined plan or system of group work which I have brought to you. Well, let me say that's the least we can do. He has spent so much organized conscious energy to bring these various aspects to us. So a cursory, superficial reading will not suffice. So he says, repeating again, I would ask you to ponder deeply upon the various aspects of the outlined plan or system of group work which I brought you, for it is a tentative endeavor to externalize upon earth certain phases of hierarchical endeavor. Well, let me say certainly not all, but certain phases of the hierarchy's intended work. That much we can take responsibility for. So then going on to further statements about the chitta, the energy used, he says, in the telepathic work is the chitta, as the Hindus call it, or the mind stuff, which underlies and is the very substance of manifestation itself. So there's a question, isn't there, about whether we're talking about material or energy, and in the last analysis, all matter is energy. This has been proven to us with the advances made in understanding energy as matter during the 20th century. Now, of course, we're in the 21st, and still greater revelations lie ahead. DK goes on to say, God, the planetary life or logos, however, works with the higher correspondence of this mind stuff, and the forces of the mental plane are the reflection, or rather the densification of this higher mental substance. Well, the question will arise, are we talking about the matter energy of the higher mental plane, or are we looking altogether at the atmic plane, the third, that's the significant number from the highest or logoic plane? So that word densification, I think, is interesting. And what can it mean? You know, maybe that the atoms of that particular strata, the concrete stratum, are larger and more complex and consist of more of what is called bubbles in the koilon than will the mental atoms of the spiritual triad, and also far more complex and dense than the atoms of the atmic plane, which is a plane of will in one sense, but also a plane of mind, as it is the third. So God, the planetary life or logos, however, works with the higher correspondence of this mind stuff, and the forces of the mental plane are a reflection, or rather, and let me say this is the proper word, the densification of this higher mental substance. These forces, this mind stuff, is constantly in flux and in motion. And may I say, it has a correspondence to the gaseous element, which we know is always in movement. This, says the Tibetan, produces that thought-form-making activity of the mental world, which is set in motion by minds, working either individually or in group formation. Well, let's go this far, and distinguish certain sections here. We have been dealing here with thought-form-making activity, and with the interesting idea that the thought forms made by the group can be utilized and directed by the master. So it's not just the individual thought forms which count, but the group thought forms with the master behind it, utilizing such a group-made thought forms as an instrument of amelioration for various kinds of conditions. So DK goes on and says, in true telepathic work, carried forward without error and correctly from a poised point of action, now right away we suspect that we are not engaged in this true telepathic work, but in any case, carried forward, he says, without error and correctly, and from a poised point of action, the currents of this mind stuff are set in motion between certain points by the will, and carefully expressed and formulated idea in the mind of the thinker. So let us say that we are becoming the manipulators of currents of thought energy, which will have their hopefully benevolent effect on the presently mass consciousness of humanity. DK goes on to say, a certain portion of this mind stuff already in motion is built into form and then travels along the current as set up between the 2 points. The telepathic worker, going on with DK, the telepathic worker, such as, for instance, myself, works from the angle of the mind of the transmitter and that of the recipient. Perhaps we can say this is how he was working with Alice Bailey. DK goes on to say, establishing first of all a current of rapport, which you sometimes call sensing the Tibetan's vibration. We can see, can we not, that this is very practical, technical information. DK goes on, along that current, I send the impression, the idea, or the thought form, which I seek to see impinging first of all upon your minds. So that's the plural, he's working with the group as a whole, he's saying, impinging first of all upon your minds, and then if you are capable of such alignment, upon your brains. Because, may I say, after all, we're dealing with an externalization process, and the brain is the outermost organ in the mental world regarding externalization. DK then says, this process can be either rapid or slow. Where the alignment is good, there can be an almost immediate response to my thought. Where it is not good, it may take days and even weeks for the impression to be finally released and consciously registered on the disciple's mind and brain. So what we have here is a very technical explanation of how DK works to impress the minds and the brains of his co-workers. Maybe sometimes the individual, but it seems to me that he is more intent on impressing the entire group. And we remember those questions that he asked us to ponder in all truth. Have you ever, I think he begins with, have you ever truthfully felt my vibration? So he's working with currents of energy, and he seems to be working above soul levels from what are now for him ashramic levels within the spiritual triad. And he's well aware of the fact that when we attempt consciously to impress someone we seek to help, or maybe our group tries to impress a group it seeks to help, or an individual, it's quite possible that we do work subject to error and incorrectly. And it will take some time to render our intention to impress pure and accurate. He does speak of himself as a telepathic worker. Well, that's pretty obvious. I mean, there he is in physically in northern India, or wherever he is now, probably northern India, he said so, and working with accuracy, extreme accuracy, with the mind of Alice Bailey, who has been trained over lifetimes to sense his vibration and hear his words. And they did, as we have been told, work out between them a mode of English which was suitable to convey what he wanted to convey. He did receive assistance from her, it seems to me, regarding the more modern usage of the English language. He had been trained in that language in an earlier time, and his formulations reflect that older type of English. So, do we sense, truthfully, the Tibetan's vibration? Does he get through to us? Do we feel that ripple, as he describes it? He doesn't use the word much, but maybe there's a ripple on the top of the head. And I remember once, after a very powerful arcane school meditation in headquarters, Mary Bailey commented about she felt that the top of her head would just blow off. So much was the pressure that she felt from the ashramic impression. So it seems to me that one of the main things is to set up a good alignment with the soul, and later using the antakarana with the spiritual triad. And, well, it's up to us, isn't it? We don't expect fantastic results. Well, when you use the word phenomenal or fantastic, it doesn't cover it, but we don't expect truly uplifting results immediately if we have not established a good alignment. There is such an inner world that we are trying to enter and work within. It's very different from our customary level of working. And I'm sure that difference will appear to us when we have actually entered the world of the soul and are stabilized in soul meditation and eventually beyond. But we are to expect no gross realization. It is subtle. and has to be approached with, well, maybe the word is some delicacy. Okay, DK goes on. He says there are other groups which are consciously working with the energy which can dispel glamour and illusion. Now, let us say the technique of light and the illusory technique, what's it called again? Okay, well, it's slipping my mind, you know. There is the technique of indifference for the myopic dispersion, and the technique of light for the glamorous dissipation. And well, okay, I'm just going to have to allow it to go away, but it does dispel illusion. And of course, it will come back to me. It has to do with the, of course, the intuition. So anyway, there are those groups working with the dispelling of glamour and illusion. This is the energy of the highest level of the astral plane. Well, wouldn't you know it, I couldn't resist refreshing my mind, and I don't know how it slipped away from me. But the technique of the presence. The technique of the presence, dispelling illusion, the technique of light, dissipating glamour, the technique of indifference, dispersing Maya. And I sometimes think that to register this presence is one of the very highest things that we can do at our particular stage of evolution. And when we have our work in the identify as being, we are really dealing with the doctrine of the heart, which heart registers the presence, even as the eye registers all the detail of any object or perception. This presence brings being forward first and does not get pulled in by form. It's a completely different kind of registration. So anyway, this highest level of the astral plane, okay, this is, I wonder if he's saying that illusion is related to the highest level of the astral plane, or is he saying that these groups so abundantly equipped with those who have the sixth ray in their ray chart are well suited to dissipate glamour. About this level, the highest level of the astral plane, apparently. And we find that there is, on that level, emotional idealism, imagination, and then a kind of mental clairvoyance. This level is susceptible to reaction or response to that type of energy, which we call the energy of intuition or of buddhi, if you like the Oriental terminology. So he seems to be saying that this energy of wisdom, buddhi, intuition, is used not only to dispel illusion through the technique of the presence, but is used as well in relation to dispelling glamour. He uses the word dispel for both, dispelling glamours that may be found on the highest levels of the astral plane. The plane, well, if we take two subplanes, emotional idealism and imagination, subplanes 1 and 2. This wisdom energy, he says, is the only type of force which is adequate to dispel the miasmas, the fogs, and the mists of the world of glamour. Now, if my memory serves, he did say you had to be careful about applying soul energy straight to the astral plane because you could make it worse. But here he seems to be speaking of something coming from the spiritual triad, which does dispel the fogs and mists of the worlds of glamour. So not only the weakening of glamour and its dissipation through the technique of light, but the dispelling of the glamour, apparently, through a triadal flow. And he goes on to say, those disciples who are working in these groups have to learn to use this energy to work wisely. And may I say, there is the word wise or wisdom or wisely, because buddhi is wisdom, and wisdom is more than just knowledge. So they have to gather their experience over time and learn how and when to apply. So repeating then what DK has said, those disciples who are working in these groups have to learn to use this energy to work wisely, to think with wisdom, may I say, there's that word again, and to realize that wisdom itself is a force. I wonder, have we realized that? Can we apply not just knowledge, but wisdom to these clarifications which we are attempting to institute? So DK goes on. It is this realization which makes a person seek out another person with wisdom when he is in trouble and difficulty, and is anxious to see with clarity the way he should go. May I say, we have sought out Master DK, and some will seek out even more accomplished individuals, though it's hard for me to imagine how we would not benefit from DK's wise indications first. DK goes on, it is this realization which drives the members of the human family to the masters of the wisdom. Well, we know, don't we, what it's like not to be able to know the correct way to solve our problems. And pretty soon, according to the Tibetan, the human race will be in that condition and will have to call upon hierarchy rather than call upon the selfish egomaniacs. That has nothing to do with the true ego, who seem to care only for power. That's not real guidance. That's just pandering to the lower aspects of the troubled mass, which is so misled and so uncertain. So it's a using of the foibles of mass consciousness against itself. Some of this mass consciousness is channeled through such groups as MAGA, Make America Great Again, at least at this particular time. Now, you may be, if you are listening to this, listen to it long after that problem has been solved. But it is a mass consciousness which shows little sign of elevation. And so, may I say, Sanat Kumara tightens the screws a bit more and comes up with these variants of the dreaded disease or epidemic, which is now sweeping through humanity, tightening the screws, as it were, until humanity really begins to wake up. And already there are some signs that it is so. So what we're seeing here is that although we use the technique of light to dissipate glamour, there is another process which really dispels, if I may call it, dispels glamour, and it comes from the plane of wisdom. This is the wisdom energy. This wisdom energy is the only type of force, DK says, which is adequate to dispel the miasmas, the fogs, the mists of the world of glamour. So, what I would ask is, well, what is the triple beam of light doing? Maybe the job is not quite complete. And since we might say that the Buddhic energy, the energy of the spiritual triad from a number of ashrams grows and is noticed at the time of the third initiation, maybe it is not until the third initiation that these major glamours are actually banished. And until that time, even for accepted disciples, and maybe even for chelas on the thread, these glamours remain. Now, the rich young man, we're told, was it a glamour? He was counting on his accumulations. He was a just, law-abiding individual. He abided by the spiritual law. Was he counting on that to bring him through? Probably. Was it a glamour? The Christ had a further demand. Sell all you have, give the proceeds to the poor. Now, what does that mean? Basically, use everything you've got and help those who need it, and then follow me. But that is the problem of attachment, apparently, even at the third initiation, attachment to the causal body, even at the third initiation. Now, DK goes on with some interesting material. In Atlantean days, and here I am telling you something of interest, and something which should evoke a sense of responsibility, and may I say, he never tells us something that's just meant to delight and interest us. The important thing here, I think, is that the interest will lead to a more intense application of spiritual responsibility. So he says, in Atlantean days, the major task of the masters of wisdom was with the great world illusion, or rather glamour. Now, I want to say that these words are oftentimes used interchangeably. Glamour is all three: illusion, glamour, and Maya. Illusion is all three: illusion, glamour, and Maya. And Maya is all three: illusion, glamour, and Maya. And that's when these words are used in the general sense. So he's calling the happenings on the astral plane, the great world illusion, or rather glamour. Every time we see that word illusion, it doesn't mean that we have to say, the illusion of the mental plane. That's called dropping a mouse. Okay, well, there's more to it. We have to know whether a term is being used in a general sense or a specific sense. In Atlantean days, and surely we all participated in those days, whether we were individualized within the earth chain or upon the moon chain, or even within the previous and great solar system, the first of the great solar systems. We've all been Atlanteans. Sometimes when I look at certain comic books, I'm not a comic book reader, okay, but they cross my range of sight, and I see, my goodness, this really looks Atlantean. All these dramatic, fantastical episodes, this battle between good and evil and so forth, it looks very Atlantean. Now, I don't think any of us remembers with accuracy a great number of our Atlantean incarnations. We may pretend. Some people have pretended. I had a couple of students, and one of them said to me, "You killed me in Atlantis." Okay. Okay. I don't know where that came from. But the soul has a great memory. And whatever the personality may think, the soul may or will correct it, and the karma will be paid. So here's the work of the masters, because indeed they were working against great odds to try to salvage the consciousness of humanity. Great strides were being made, and so naturally the lords of form intervened to try to prevent the lords of light, the lords of the shining countenance, as they are called, from winning the battle. These lords of form were sometimes called, you probably remember, lords of the dark face. And look at the Star Wars series and how the force, so to speak, is dramatized, and the light side of the force and the dark side of the force are brought forward in opposition. There's so much about Atlantis we don't really know, except if we are students of esotericism, we are convinced that it did exist, and other people think, of course, we're quite crazy, but we're convinced it did exist, and more the details and the remnants of its existence will emerge. Even the remnants of the old Shambhala in South America, now covered by such thick forests, but jungles But methods are now found to penetrate that and to see what an elaborate system of interconnected centers did exist. The so-called Temple of Ibez, some 17 million years ago. And was there actually a temple? You know, a stone or a constructed temple? And will it, if there was, will it be discovered, or are we simply left with the thought that this Temple of Ibez was the first embodiment of Shambhala? So in those far-off times, millions of years ago, remember, early Atlantis was said to be 12 million years ago, and maybe the great battle south of Delhi, the actual embodiment of Kurukshetra, not simply the internal process of the disciple, but 4 million years ago, maybe. Philip Lindsay, in his various books, I think, has a very good sense of timing about these occurrences, and if we read Blavatsky carefully, we will also gather much and find out that there were many floods and cataclysms, and not just one flood, let's say, that sunk 2 islands somewhat off the coast of Europe. There's just much more we just don't know, but the best thing is to put our hand in the hand of our guide and trust, and in that trust, revelation will come. So going on with the Tibetan, these masters of the wisdom, they worked then primarily upon the astral plane, and had they not done so, human life and conditions, says the Tibetan, would not be so good as they are, for they are in reality full of beauty, the beauty of potentiality, hovering upon the verge of immediacy of expression. And let's just say that that immediacy of expression has to do with the coming of the Aquarian age. Sometimes we may look around and say, well, things are pretty terrible, you know, right now, and people are abysmally selfish, and where is the goodwill between people that will allow the Christ to reappear? Where is the peace? Where is the sharing? Where is the house cleaning? The 3 requirements. But if we are carefully attentive, we will see some of these things shaping up. So always it's the hierarchy working for the betterment of humanity, the other kingdoms, and the planet as a whole. And we have to admire, I think, DK's vision about conditions which are full of beauty and which promise the wonder of the new age and ready to precipitate. Now, how does he see that? When we tend to oftentimes see quite the opposite. Well, isn't it his own penetration into the essentials behind the scenes That's really what's going on there. He can see what we cannot see. And one day, learning to align with hierarchy and patiently carry through the kinds of duties we can handle, we will be absorbed into a higher state, which will make possible for us acquaintance with and expression of what they can now handle and we cannot. So let us say much of wonder lies ahead. The medieval person, I suppose, could hardly conceive of what has happened in the last 700, 800, 900 years since medievalism was the prevailing culture or civilization. And we're in the same situation. Maybe some very prescient seers can conceive of something which is accurate. It's not just all space cars traveling around at different levels. We have such an externalized material consciousness. We even think that, ancient aliens? It's kind of a program that says, well, life came in spaceships to the Earth. Well, life may have come, or human units may have come from the sacred planets, but there's no need for spaceships and things that are so material. We might say that maybe spaceships have visited the planet, but to look at our planet and say that somehow the origin of human life was brought by those spaceships, I think, is simply a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of the subtle esoteric worlds, which of course is something we want to correct in the mass consciousness. But in order to do that, we have to be quite sure of these things ourselves and actually have the experience and not just thoughts. The Tibetan goes on to say, today, they are working primarily upon the mental plane. Now, let's pause, contrast. They worked on the plane of the great illusion, which was the astral plane in those days, those far-off days. And now they work because of human progress upon the mental plane. DK goes on saying, dealing with ideas and with their impression upon the minds of their disciples and advanced humanity, because yes, advanced humanity, just go to the astrology book, page 332 and 333. Advanced humanity is right there in the progress of the human race. So humanity is far more intelligent. Alice Bailey emphasizes this. Why should we say that A few of those gathered around the Christ represented somehow the limit of human intelligence at the time. It's just not so. So anyway, the hierarchy today works upon the minds of their disciples and advanced humanity. It is, says the Tibetan, the problem of humanity itself as a whole to work in the world glamour, and indeed we attempt that. We work now with techniques the Tibetan has given us. And he trusts us with those techniques. So, whereas hierarchy has moved up in its focus, we have, in a way, begun to take over the dissipation of glamour and the dispelling of the miasmas of the great illusion. DK goes on to say, it is the responsibility of the aspirants of the world to guide humanity out of the valley of glamour. That's a really important sentence. Men must learn, he says, to understand it, and eventually, aided by the senior disciples of the world, trained by the masters of the wisdom, to transmute and to dispel it. Now, here he's talking a lot about the transmutation and dispelling of glamour. He seems more to speak of the dissipation of glamour in the glamour book, Glamour, A World Problem. Well, think about that for a minute. To guide humanity out of the valley of glamour, and maybe it's through offering humanity the chance to think with clarity. It's not always easy, and I've been using that word recalcitrant, you know. It's kind of a stubborn resistance, the recalcitrant attachment of millions to the old thought forms and the old desires works against this project of helping humanity out of the valley of glamour. I sometimes find myself taking on certain projects. Maybe it's wrong, you know. I say to myself, well, this individual has the potential to make the bridge out of the mass consciousness into a more illumined consciousness. And then I often set my sights, rightly or wrongly, upon trying to help that individual. And generally, I ask permission in certain ways. Would you be interested in hearing about another possibility? I find that with Christian people, the idea that Jesus, or really the Christ, spoke to the masses in parables, but to the disciples of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. I find that that stimulates at least the curiosity of people who want to know what the Christ said and whether it was different or not from what the scriptures in parable are saying. And I think that's a bridge. Maybe sometimes reincarnation is a bridge too far, except to point out the belief in it by the Essenes, of whom apparently Jesus himself was a member, and how for some hundreds of years reincarnation was an acceptable part of Christianity till it was written away by those who wanted more power for themselves and wanted the priests to be the intermediaries between the individual and God. But even that can be transparent to the thinking person. Now, so many instances of conversion these days are really appalling, and they basically are saying, believe as I believe or die. At this time we have something terrible going on in the fall of Afghanistan to the virulent religious fanatics who are going from door to door killing people who are on their kill list for having cooperated with the Americans over the last 20 years, and we have young girls being ripped out of the house to serve as sex slaves simply because apparently Muhammad said that was okay. So there has to be correction there, obviously. We have fallen deeply into certain glamours. And they're very thick. And they are self-justifying. They justify our own animal desires, and we don't give them a second thought because a revered teacher proclaimed them. But all of that will have to be cast to the wayside. And soon. And we don't know how that will happen. But part of this esoteric work, the dissipation, the dispelling, using the esoteric methods, those methods will have a beneficent effect if we really stick with them, protect ourselves, protect those upon whom we seek to make impression. There are so many ways to do it right, and so many customary ways of doing it incorrectly. And that's why very deep study of what a great teacher like the Tibetan has to say is necessary. So anyway, repeating what the Tibetan says, it is the responsibility now, I add, of the aspirants of the world to guide humanity out of the valley of glamour. Notice it's not the mountaintop of glamour. And we might have even called it the swamp of glamour, where the ancient Hydra thrives, the swamp of Lerna. DK goes on, men must learn to understand it. And may I add, it's not easy to understand, and it's not easy to understand the glamours with which we individually are beset, or our groups beset. What would DK say to us as he was writing to the others? What would he say to us as he tried to help us recognize the glamours into which we had fallen? Probably it would all come as quite a surprise. And maybe we would say, well, I never thought of that. That was the case with quite a number, I think, of the students. They may have thought their personality or soul ray were thus and so, or their glamours were thus and so, and DK corrected their impressions. So of glamour, he says, men, of course, men and women, brothers, must learn to understand it, and eventually, aided by the senior disciples of the world, trained by the masters of the wisdom, and may I say in many ways the masters are, from one perspective, the senior disciples, learn to transmute and dispel it. Transmutation, I think, seems to be an improvement in the quality and purity of matter. In this case, the matter which has been gathered into certain obstructive and misleading forms. So going on, you should therefore, he says, bear in mind that the task before the modern disciple, even if this was written, may I say, 90 years ago, we are still the modern disciple, aren't we? If we're even the disciple. The task before the modern disciple is to carry forward into the New Age the idea of the bringing of glamour and of the great illusion into the light of day, may I add. That light of day comes through Scorpio. Scorpio rules that collection of monads called the human, the initiates. And Scorpio rules also the entire Buddhic plane, since Scorpio can be considered, however strangely, the sign of illumination and not just the sign of darkness. So bringing glamour and the great illusion into the light, that's what we, hopefully the modern disciple, have to do. In the light, it will disappear. So that's why we have to consider ourselves, and with justification, as light bearers. It's not enough to say, well, I'm a light worker, I'm a light bearer. We actually do have to focus within the light of the soul It's a Leonian type of focus. We have to focus within the wisdom and the still greater light of the triad under Scorpio. You might think of it this way, that under the scorpionic vision, the lower Scorpio of the astral plane and the swamp will disappear in the great light of day. So it is important to, when thinking of the 12 signs of the zodiac, become aware on page 329, 330, right there or so, in esoteric astrology, of what are the different lights which these signs of the zodiac from constellations of the zodiac are releasing towards the earth. It's obvious, isn't it, friends, that we want to live a more lighted life and not be trapped in the ancient miasms that somehow our fears attach us to. Okay, DK goes on. In this age, maybe it's the Piscean age, the age of Pisces Virgo. In this age, he says, we have mastered too well, perhaps, the forces of nature and have brought out for our own benefit the material resources of the physical plane. Well, what have we done? We've mined those resources. We've extracted them from the earth, and yes, we have used them for our selfish purposes. And the forces of nature, well, look what's happened since the scientific revolution, which we might say was impulsed by Francis Bacon under his very strongly Aquarian nature, Aquarius with its fifth ray. We've gotten ahead of ourselves, so much so that the hierarchy had to pull back on granting independence to the fifth ray ashram for what, maybe 50 years, making that ashram more a subsidiary of the greater third ray ashram, which also it is, but at least you would not have a runaway on your hands. Now, I guess the question arises, has the fifth ray ashram been restored to an independent status? Sometimes when I look at what's being discovered, it seems it has. So here we have forces of nature mastered. We have material resources extracted, and we don't have a sufficient reduction of selfishness with regard to these forces and resources. Instead, we quite stupidly want to, it's another scorpionic tendency, to corner the market, get everything for ourselves, so that we can own those resources and the symbols connected with them, which give us power. Now, money is such a symbol. DK goes on to say, we have conquered them and bent them to our will and use, often selfishly, but may I say he's giving us the benefit of the doubt here, going on, yet sometimes with good and pure intent. Well, that's one thing. Man has been victorious over the often latent condition of these forces and resources, which, may I say, are meant to be shared by all and for the benefit of all kingdoms and for the advancement of our earth, not for the petty, selfish advancement of a few units of human life who are clever enough to accumulate them and to use them selfishly. DK goes on, in the new age, a paralleling control will take place over the world of astral phenomena and over the forces of glamour and illusion. We seek to control them today, mentally and theoretically. Well, may I say, there's nothing wrong with the mental control, and he does often advise us regarding the usefulness of such control. But, says the Tibetan, only the energy of wisdom will suffice to dispel the forces of world glamour and the world illusion. And may I say, in this book, he's really emphasizing dispelling in relation to glamour. Now, maybe he's considering glamour to be illusion, glamour, and Maya, but wisdom from the Buddhic plane is necessary when he's dealing strictly with the technique of light. He does not so much emphasize the energies coming from the Buddhic plane. Practice wisdom, my brothers, he says, and thus aid humanity and shorten its astral struggle. Well, there's a piece of advice, isn't it? Let's pause. How would we practice wisdom? I think, don't you, that we would have to have some sense of the progression of what our thoughts and actions lead to, an accurate sense of what they lead to. we would have to act and think in such a way that through our wisdom, the divine plan would come closer to externalization on the earth. We would have to, on the basis of our experience, look ahead. Well, right now, and for many millennia past, it has been the forces of nature and the materials of nature which have been, what can I call it, exploited, often for selfish purposes, but sometimes with pure intent. And now we're moving up a bit on this ladder of purification. And it won't be long before we are really dealing with the plane of the greatest illusion, considering illusion in the inclusive, comprehensive sense, the astral plane. So let's bear in mind that as much as he talks about the dissipation of glamour through the technique of light, he is also talking now very much about the dispelling of glamour through the energy of wisdom, and this time I remember it, through the technique of the presence. We have an obligation, don't we, to our fellow human beings still trapped in a limited state of consciousness. Well, our state of consciousness is also limited, but at least we have some idea of what the Aquarian age can bring, and some idea of the foundations of esotericism. Our fellow human beings, in their millions and maybe billions, do not have that idea. So through our radiation, the words we speak, the thoughts we think, we have to be both dissipating and dispelling agents. And I probably shouldn't leave out that we must also be dispersing agents. We have a big cleanup job to do. Kind of reminds one of King Augeas, is that how we pronounce it, who had left the stables on 3 levels uncleansed for many years, and invited Hercules in to clear out the dung. But Hercules was resourceful, just the way the scientists in the New Age will be unexpectedly resourceful. And rather than clear out the mess shovelful by shovelful, he released the rivers, Alpheus and Peneus, which seem to correlate with the Kundalini energy, and swiftly he cleansed the stables. We have to understand that Aquarius is a great healing or I should say cleansing, and thus healing sign. Of course, if we remember correctly, King Alpheus felt tricked. He was not very grateful. And if the representatives of Hercules come along in the Aquarian age and say, I can do this for you, and then they do it, there is, well, almost a guarantee that those who are fighting the rearguard action, those who like all that accumulation, will deplore what Hercules has done and criticize him and endanger him. So this has something to do with the fate of the new group of world servers. Maybe to some degree a thankless task, but one which has to be carried out for the sake of the planet, and not just for the sake of a relatively few powerful personalities. DK is talking about different groups that are gathering. Other groups have the task of working with the energy which is well known and much discussed, prana, or life energy, the energy of vitality. Well, it might be questioned, are we talking about earth prana, or are we talking about the prana from the sun? And of course, the prana from the sun is the higher type of prana. And vitality comes in two types. One in relation to the normal etheric body of the systemic etheric physical plane, and the other in relation to the cosmic ethers, which are Buddhic, atmic, monadic, and logoic. They are both pranic energies, life energies. I'm reminded about the first-rate type of healing to throw this vital energy into the patient and then thereby help to restore the waning vitality. The right use, he says, of the pranic energies, and they are 7 in number. I think, those are brought in and discussed in the light of the soul. They seem to rule different parts of the human energy system. Will most assuredly dissipate disease and bodily ills, and will cure the pains of the physical vehicle. I'm reminded that DK says if we can get the spine working as it should and the spleen, that there will be very few physical ills with which the disciple has to deal. And so we can say, probably with accuracy, that the vitality we're looking to utilize is much connected with the spine and the spleen because they both have the same effect. They dissipate disease and bodily ills and will cure the pains of the human physical vehicle. Pain can be a terrible taskmaster. And DK talks about people seeking in death release from pain. DK goes on here, but in connection with this, two things are essential, and these are seldom found together. Well, may I say it is a source of confidence and right or anticipation of a joyful kind that the day of banishing disease, notice now here he uses the word dissipate, the same word that he uses in connection with glamour and its dissipation. But it is an anticipatory joy to look ahead and say, these chains upon humanity will be broken. And an altogether different form of kind of life will be the result. But, okay, here's the problem. If we want this to happen, two things have to happen. And we don't find these two essentials together very often. So what does he tell us? That the energy of the soul, like the energy of the universal mind, is that on its lowest level, the atmic plane, and the energy of buddhi, or the intuition, has to be set in action upon the physical plane by the one to be healed and by the healer. Both have to work in cooperation. So I'm suspecting we're dealing with triadal energies here, with the monastic permanent atom, with the energy coming from the Buddhic permanent atom onto the Buddhic plane, the energies of Atma as well, and the one to be healed in this way cannot be totally ignorant of what the process may be. Of course, I imagine Master Moria speaks of healing energies being so tangible that the bed in which the afflicted one is found even begins to shake. And maybe under some circumstances, there will be the application of energy without too much having to be done by the afflicted one, who may not be in much of a condition to do much. But still more ideally, there has to be some kind of cooperation between the one to be healed and the healer. And he definitely says, yes, set in motion also by the one to be healed. Okay, so maybe esoteric healing does not work in its maximal sense for all. And also, there must be right understanding of the disease and its cause. May I add, probably esoteric causes, plus the karmic status of the patient and the condition of his centers, his alignment and point in evolution. Well, I wonder if it's not demanding too much to expect that the patient will understand all this, but at least the healer has to understand this. I think so many of us do not understand our karmic status, as it says here, nor do we necessarily understand the degree to which our centers, our chakras, are functioning. To the very first disciple to whom instructions were written in the Dynabooks, DK gave the percentages of the openness of the chakras. I think probably the individual himself, though very intelligent, had no real idea as to those percentages. So, can these things be found together? Can the energy of the soul and the energy of universal mind and the energy of buddhi or intuition all be set in action on the physical plane by both the one to be healed and the healer? Can there be also right understanding of the disease and its, may I add, real cause, plus the karmic status of the patient and the condition of his centers, his alignment, and his point in evolution? Well, maybe, as he says, these requirements are rarely met in the same situation. But DK goes on and says, as yet, we are only dealing with the ABC of these relatively new sciences, and much of our initial work must be of a clarifying nature, because there is so much distorted sensing of these occult systems of energy utilization and so much misuse of these powers. So basically he's saying, let's at least understand what we're talking about. There's a joke that about esoteric healers that they just can't wait to get their hands on you, you know. Well, maybe there is some truth in that, and insufficient study of the individual to be healed is not undertaken. Somewhere DK says, look before you do anything in the advising of an individual. You have to study his condition for some 5 hours. The number 5 is interesting. It's the number of the fifth kingdom, the number of Venus, in a way, the number of the soul. 5 hours. And which ones of us, given what we think our busy schedules to be, undertake such an intensive study? Of the one to be helped. Well, you know, possible to go on a little bit, but not much more. He's talking about different groups, right? Some of these groups look like they are the groups which are among the seed groups, but in various places in his books, he discusses groups that are not members of his seed group, such as groups that work especially with, I'm remembering one, sound and color. There are others like that. There are many group ways to approach the amelioration of the human condition. Other groups, he says, are associated in a peculiar manner with the number 4, and they are occupied with the bridging work carried forward between the personality and the monad. Well, you might wonder there whether Mercury is involved. The occupied they are with the bridging work carried forward between the personality and the monad. The triple lower man and the spiritual triad, and also between the lower mind, the soul, and the higher mind, thus linking that relatively lower triplicity with the unity, the spiritual triad. And then he kind of explains this, that the fourth kingdom in nature is, in its turn, a bridging kingdom. Well, why does he say that? You know, among the 7 kingdoms, which are found on the cosmic physical etheric plane, the human kingdom is the centermost kingdom. Mineral, vegetable, animal, human, kingdom of souls, kingdom of planetary lives, kingdom of solar lives. Yes, it occupies the middlemost kingdom. So let's read that again because it's a little bit little complex. Other groups, he says, are associated in a peculiar manner with the number 4, of course, immediately I think of Mercury and the 4th ray and the 4th position. And they are occupied with the bridging work carried forward between the personality and the monad. Well, you've got a 4 there, the personality as a whole, plus the 3 aspects of the spiritual triad leading to the monad. So it's 4 leading to the 1. From another perspective, it might be considered the 6 or 7 leading to the 1. So bridging work carried forward between the personality and the monad, the triple lower man, and the spiritual triad. So that would be 3 plus the 1 of the spiritual triad, thus a 4, and also between the lower mind, the soul, and the higher mind, linking to what? To the spiritual triad, considered as a unity, and thus another 4. The 4th kingdom of nature is, in its turn, a bridging kingdom between the 3 superhuman kingdoms and the 3 subhuman. Well, we are familiar with that idea. And just now, we are trying to make our way into the 5th kingdom, the kingdom of souls, where the majority of masters focus their consciousness. Now, he goes on to say again, the 4th plane, which must be reached by the bridge of light, the antikarana, okay, is the link between the 3 higher worlds of spiritual being and the 3 lower worlds of human endeavor and experience. So the mental, emotional, and physical plane are these 3 lower worlds of human endeavor and experience, and the atmic, monadic, and logoic planes are the 3 higher worlds of spiritual being, with the buddhic plane being the linking plane. And upon that buddhic plane, our collection of initiates, a collection of monads called the initiates, are found focused. That is the human creative hierarchy. I'm not talking about the human kingdom now. The human creative hierarchy of monads are focused in that bridging world. DK goes on, the energy with which the group of disciples along this line of activity has to work is the light of the soul. Remembering ever that light is substance. Well, the whole universe is light, or what we might call the materialization of that ephemeral something we call light. But light is substantial. Light is substance. And the light of the soul, as I said, governed by that great source of illumination, which is Leo. So we have to remember, remembering ever, he says, that light is substance. Their effort, he says, is to create, and as individuals and also as a group of disciples, a great pathway of light between the personality and the spiritual triad, atma-buddhi-manas, or spiritual will, intuitive understanding, and the higher mind. This is what we're trying to do, to create a pathway of light, which we call the antakarana. Well, we certainly have to study the number 4. Presently, it seems to be the soul ray of humanity, the 4th ray. We're told by DK that the number 4, as it applies to the mind, is very important in his work, perhaps because the law of analogy is so much employed. Perhaps simply because we as monads are a 4th group, and we have to understand the implications of that, where we work and why we work upon the Buddhic or 4th plane. So something quite advanced actually is offered in these books. I don't know if it's offered elsewhere. In books published in the West, how to build the antakarana. He spends maybe 100 pages giving us instruction on how to build the antakarana in the rays and the initiations, and over again. It's worth the study of those methods. When you really stop to think of it, you know, the mind of Master DK is so expansive, capacious, deep, detailed, and organized, and filled with types of light that we don't even suspect, that you begin to wonder how we can absorb any significant part of it, any impartation that he would give us. But I always comfort myself a little bit by saying, well, what man has done, man can do. And it may take time, centuries, in some cases some centuries of study, as I think the Tibetan master was given to, but the day will arise, or arrive. So all of this is about the number 4 and its prominence, its importance in our development, and I might add, in our struggles It is a warring ray, and of this ray, DK says, loaded with the panoply of war, he comments on the warrior nature of the fourth ray, and in general of the number 4. I think, friends, the further we go, the more the possibilities open up before us, and we begin to realize the extraordinary gift, I've said so many times, which has been bequeathed to us through the voluntary work of Master DK, under the sanction and permission of Master KH and the Christ and the Lord of the world. If we just stick with it, we'll begin to realize the profundity of what has been imparted. Lately, and I don't know, maybe now for some years, I've been doing video commentaries. Now, I had written out many of these commentaries in different words, and I might have thought, well, that might be sufficient because people will simply study them and maybe benefit. But I find in going through them again, maybe in a more spontaneous manner, that so much more is coming into focus. And I begin to wonder, did I even read? Did I even comment upon what DK has said? Did I even comment in a written form? So let's count ourselves very fortunate that we are in that stream of impression which he hopes to direct towards individuals like us, and more importantly, towards groups. But somehow, when we stick with it, we are in the stream. Now, I keep on saying, hey, a little more, a little more. DK goes on to say, I have not dealt with some of the activities of these groups of disciples in the New Age, or pointed out the energies which with which they must work in order to emphasize again to you the plans for my own groups of disciples. Well, you just kind of wonder, how much can he give? There's so much decision making that has to be engaged in, because he just can't give everything he knows. He's got to think about our assimilative potential. So some of the activities he hasn't dealt with. Or has he pointed out, in all cases, I would say, the energies with which they must work in order to emphasize again to you the plans for my own groups of disciples. Well, I think that we begin to know enough, when we begin to zero in on the groups or group that we may look forward to participating in, it's enough to start. DK goes on and says, these groups with which I am engaged as part of the, and only part, may I add, part of the activity of my ashram are essentially seed groups. Now he mentions that only now and then. Going on, he says they are intended to be outposts of the hierarchical consciousness as it focuses itself through me, himself, right? As it focuses itself through me in the same sense as an individual accepted disciple is an outpost of the Master's consciousness in the world. And that, he says, is the connection which I seek to emphasize, the externalization of the inner work of the planetary hierarchy for the first time in history. And the precipitation, if you like that term, of an inner and ready condition. Going on a little more, the New Age is upon us, maybe for several hundred years, a transition from Pisces to Aquarius has been in process. The New Age is upon us, he says, and the integration of humanity in the three worlds warrants definite changes in technique, though not in basic plans. Well, if the New Age was upon us then, it is certainly increasingly upon us now. Something's working through Master Decay, the entire hierarchy, just as he is working through his accepted disciples. Are you, am I, an accepted disciple? Well, we have discussed that matter. It is the third phase of discipleship. Is Master DK working through us because we are an accepted disciple, or working through a group of which we may be a part, that group being composed of accepted disciples? I think we must not jump to conclusions. In fact, we must be cautious and not presume. But think of it being an outpost of the Master's consciousness. What that could mean. ideas would come, of course. New ideas, new perceptions. We would be, in some way, standing on the shoulders of giants, as the story goes. That would be the effect of being an outpost of the Master's consciousness. Every full moon, maybe every new moon, we have a chance to position ourselves with our group as an outpost of the Master's consciousness, and we begin to see in a different way. We begin to see somewhat as he sees, which is certainly a lot different than our customary type of vision. I just want to say that the changes, when they come about, I think they will be quite subtle. And one will find oneself, as Alice Beatty says, slipping into the consciousness of the soul while engaging in the contemplative state. I think it's quite stultifying to abide in limited, habitual, customary consciousness. We seek relief from that. And yet it's not easy to find relief and the subtlety which is required of those who succeed in finding release from the ordinary, the habitual, the customary, everything we thought had been reality and had thought for a long time, and which probably the majority of the world thinks of as reality. So every day in our meditation, and as we develop that ongoing meditative attitude, we seek relief from the grossness of our habitual state of consciousness. But Master DK goes on and says, all this is, however, an experiment, and I would remind you that it is an experiment which I and several other initiates, he doesn't specify what degree, but by now we know he's a master, and those similarly experimenting are likely to be masters. Anyway, it is an experiment which I and several other initiates are carrying forward as members of a great spiritual organization. I think a little earlier he talked about how many there were that he was working with in this way, and how these other initiates experimenting were not known to us. But interestingly, the Master Jesus, as head of the Christian Church, does have his groups among some of the prelates of the High Church, whether Episcopal or Catholic. Anyway, he has made himself known to them. Now, whether he is one of these one of these several other initiates or not, we don't know, but it seems that he fulfills the requirement. So if this, now DK is speaking of the experiment, if it is successful, and if the spiritual momentum set up by all of you is adequate to the effort made, and does he mean the effort made by the initiates, or that the energy invested by the disciples brings some degree of commensurate success proportional to the investment of energy? Okay, maybe one or the other. If it is successful, he says, and if the spiritual momentum set up by all of you is adequate to the effort made, and if you can carry on with persistence and with untiring effort and interest, may I say, it sounds like high-level demands here, it may be possible, he says, to bring the experimental stage to an end. The hierarchy can then recognize as effectively established upon Earth, all part of the externalization process, right? As effectively established on Earth, certain focal points of energy which can constitute magnetic centers or rallying points for the new religion, the new medicine, the new psychology, the new education, the new politics. The potentialities are great. So what do we have here? Master DK holding out a promise of potential, and yes, laying upon the group a strong sense of responsibility, almost an onerous sense of responsibility. I just have to note, if you carry on with persistence and untiring effort and interest, well, that didn't happen. How many were left by the end? 8? So much for persistence, and maybe for interest. And of course, the old biblical idea, almost platitudinous, but those who put their hand to the plow and turn back are not worthy to enter the kingdom of heaven. The personality, we know, can always find alibis. I can't do it because of this, because of that. I cannot persist, or even something I consider much more dire, and which I have encountered from time to time, I'm just not interested anymore. Well, you have to wonder then about what was it at first that made them interested? In what were they really interested? But look, the possibilities are great, and I like all these news. Magnetic centers, certain focal points of energy can be brought forward as rallying points, which seems to suggest, does it not, a type of enthusiasm, which is so necessary if we are to bring the mass consciousness into an altogether higher state, and of course elevate as well our own consciousness. I like that word, rallying, because when enthusiasm wanes and when the sense of no can do settles glamorously upon a person, at a rally they may recover. And then the new religion, group 6, the new medicine, group 3, the new psychology, group 8, the new education, group 4, the new politics, group 7, and of course all the others, they can appear. And then for our encouragement, DK further says, the difficulties are not insuperable, otherwise I would not have been permitted to make this great experiment. So let me say this points to permission from the Master, KH, from the Christ, the head of the hierarchy, from Sanat Kumara, whose ashram is the hierarchy. I don't know to what extent the planetary logos per se gets into the granting of permission. He seems to be associated with the 7th initiation. And this is obviously, though very important for us and our groups, a more humble task. So again, repeating what DK says here, the difficulties are not insuperable. Otherwise, I would not have been permitted to make this great experiment. He calls it a great experiment. He goes on to say, we enter into no activities which are obviously foreordained to failure. So indeed, let me say, he has, with his superiors, looked ahead and seen the possibility of success, and as I say, another 175 years awaits, and maybe the only partial success achieved thus far will be fulfilled in these next approximately 175 years. Many experiments, he says, are being carried forward today. It's so Uranian, isn't it? This whole idea of experimentation. Many experiments are being carried forward today in the world by many members of the hierarchy in their differing grades and with their special groups. So it's not just confined, right, to the masters of the wisdom, and fourth degree initiates may be involved, or sixth degree initiates involved. So we know nothing about these experiments, and when he mentions them, he actually does say, you know nothing about who I'm working with, and so forth. Then, going on, he says, the effort can prove successful only insofar as the disciples of the world desire it, make the needed sacrifices, and think the various objectives into being. So there, may I say, the responsibility, at least partially, lands squarely upon us to rightly orient our desires, to sacrifice the non-essentials. And this is an important one, really. Think the various objectives into being. Well, it's important to know that DK foresees signs of success. At least it is possible. And that is a great encouragement. Time sometimes seems to pass so slowly, and a century has gone since the last great conclave, apparently a century. What have we accomplished? Well, we can say, well, it's all been so slow, but if one looks at the kinds of accomplishments, the good achievements and the menacing factors as well, we see that this last century has been very eventful with revolutions in science and in the fields of communication. Maybe, I'm trying to think, well, certainly in the founding of many different countries, but not necessarily in the right cooperation between those countries. well, there's more to do. But the responsibility is ours by human hands and human feet, as Christ, apparently in his Maya Varupa, drew out in the sand before that dark figure that we can presume was an earlier incarnation of Master Moria. He says, I am mentioning this at this time because in the press of world affairs, in the struggles of your own individual existence, and in the fatigue which is incident to daily work and the consequent physical liabilities, may I say, work brings liabilities of a physical kind over time. He goes on, there inevitably comes the cooling down of the earlier ardors and enthusiasm, the tired recognition of the monotony. Well, what do we mean there? Monotony, the same sameness, the same color, as it were, or the same tone. The tired recognition of the monotony of the demanded effort, with frequent staleness and unenterprising aspiration. What could that be? Aspiration in form only, without the real essence of enthusiasm under it? And all these things, yes, which, he says, untiring spiritual work demands. Well, he's trying to raise us into a condition of renewed enthusiasm, maybe it's sort of renewed inspiration, the breathing in of the fire, the breathing in of a God. He too must know these things. From the reports about Master DK, he was very ardent disciple, even, as some stories go, without discretion in some cases. But then, those are just stories. But we have to beware of the cooling down of our burning aspiration, our enthusiasm, and the tired recognition of the monotony of the demanded effort. You kind of wonder if he has not been feeling this himself. I don't imagine that he would be writing about something that he did not feel, with frequent staleness and unenterprising aspiration. Interesting form of words, and we know it is not pleasant to drink a stale drink. Something about it which just lacks the vitality of something fresh. We have to find the freshness in all we do, and yet we have to be capable of persisting despite all these things, because untiring spiritual work demands it. those are the lower moments, and maybe the bottom of the sine wave in a way. The valley experience rather than the hill experience. And DK tells us the disciple learns to pay no attention to these recurring cycles and interludes. What is this, the technique of indifference? No attention to these recurring cycles and interludes between the pairs of opposites, for he recognizes their intermittency. The science of cycles is much undertaken in Aquarius, may I say. That is a sign which is symbolized by the hills and valleys. And he does tell us about the exaltation of the Aquarian and the depths of depression into which the Aquarian can sink. Anyway, all of this is part of the rigors of the path. I don't know if this is the thorny part so much, but it does test our endurance. Master DK goes on, I do, however, seek to point out this point of danger, for danger it is, and ask you to go on with the work just as if, there we go, as if, just as if it were entirely new and fascinating. I guess when I think of my own relation to this, I've been involved in AAB work for exactly 50 years now. And work with theosophy and the attempt to understand practical occultism for years longer than that. Another 8 years before that. And I have to ask myself, because you have to examine these things before the bar of your soul. Have I ever lost my enthusiasm for this work? Now, given that the memory is fallible and that many things come up which one may not remember in detail long into the future, I would have to say one way or another, no. But probably all that is based on a lot of failures in the past. Just the way Alice Bailey had this crushing sense of failure. Maybe I should say a haunting sense of failure. Some vague memories of failure seem to haunt, and they can be used to create a great incentive to drive forward, almost to the extreme. I've seen that too. People who carry that sense of failure from either the last immediate incarnation or several incarnations ago, which are being referenced, they drive forward unrelentingly in the present incarnation as if to make up for lost time. Now, there's more here. And I find, what do I find? I find fatigue. And I find a position not too far from the beginning of number 8. Maybe I have to go on just a little. It is necessary, he says, necessary here for you also to remember that though these groups are intended to be seed groups of the New Age, 2 factors in connection with them should be remembered. You wonder sometimes how such small groups can be effective, but indeed, the mighty oak can grow from the little acorn. So, number 1 here, they constitute a unique experiment in the sense that knowing the possibilities and understanding somewhat the forces which are slowly emerging into prominence in a world rapidly adjusting itself to the new rhythms, yet, the Tibetan says, they are primarily an experiment undertaken by me, your Tibetan teacher, and a member of a certain standing in the hierarchy, with the cooperation of certain other initiates. And who are those initiates? Well, it depends on how we position Master DK as head of the 2/2 ashram or the 2/3 ashram. I know in some of my reportings I have thought of him as the head of the 2/3 ashram because the 3rd ray is so prominent, but still, if he really does have 5 masters working in his ashram, the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 masters would have to be included. So for me, the court, the jury, is out when it comes to deciding what is the greatest probability. He could still have plenty of the 3rd ray, monadically considered, and be a member of the 2/2 ashram just as the Buddha, with his 3rd ray monad, was, I think, associated with the 2/1 ashram. Well, there are great forces emerging, but basically, the Tibetan has undertaken an experiment, and somewhere in the rays and the initiations, I'm probably going too far out on a limb to say it's page 251, but somewhere in the latter part of that book, he does talk about the work for which he is or has been responsible, and stimulating these groups has not been the most important, but is important and is listed. I am not, he says, as I have already told you, the only worker along these lines, and these C groups are not the only units to be found today in the world. Oh, well, maybe this is where he talks about what I was trying to talk about a little earlier. There are, he says, for instance, several seed units. Why does he call them units and not groups? Are they more advanced? Several seed units working out into being within the framework of the Catholic Church under the inspiration of the Master Jesus. Well, I want to emphasize that, as it is corroboration, as I say, of what I was trying to say earlier. These are, he says, however, somewhat more subjective than are the groups which I am particularly interested, and their emergence is slower. But they do exist. And there are also 2 such seed groups in China and 4 in India. I mention this in order to safeguard you against the sense of uniqueness, which is the subtle seed of the great heresy of separateness. That's interesting. I don't remember reading that. 2 in China, probably maybe connected in some way with Taoism or with the 2 fourth root race Manus of a kind, and 4 in India. That's a lot. So that's 6, and some under the Master Jesus, and 10 under the Tibetan. So it really is an hierarchical experiment. Above all, we have to maintain that broad and inclusive picture, which does not regard ourselves as the only I, as in only I can fix it. Every time you run into a statement like, only I can do something, you know you're in danger of the lower type of egotism. But basically, it is the Tibetan and his experiments about which we can know a little something, and about the others we seem to know not much at all, except that they do exist, and what their modus operandi might be will be up to the master who is gathering such groups, and I assume it will be a master. And then, what are we looking at here? Two factors connected with the seed groups should be remembered. Factor number 2, these groups of disciples are all passing through the formative stage, and change and adjustment is going on. Their pattern is still fluid because too many disciples are receptive to the words of the Master and less receptive to the ideas upon which they, the Masters, found their work. This comment warrants your attention. And may I say that words are one thing, but an idea is a living thing, which the word, if possible, or symbol, should embody to some degree. So, as I well know, and probably you do too, it's very easy to memorize a lot of words. Very easy. But is it the real thing? Is it the energy itself? The energy of an idea? An idea is a being which gives shape and form to shapeless substance. So, through Antakarana building, let us see if we can enter into the realm of ideas and not be satisfied, as so many are, and as I certainly have been for much of my life, with simply the words that represent the ideas. DK goes on to say, later, when the needed adjustments are made and groups of disciples can work together without criticism or misunderstanding, and may I say, probably even then, that was a condition of group interaction, and probably if we are honest about our own groups today, we will find criticism and misunderstanding also present. But later they will be harmonized units, and then, says the Tibetan, they can pass on to organized group work. Right now, we're just beginning. So this, he says, is necessarily dependent upon the general level of the group endeavor. Everybody has to contribute, right? It's not enough to think of oneself as a group, as a bunch of individuals. It's a group. The general level of group endeavor, dependent also, he says, upon their aspiration and their applied persistence. Group endeavor aspiration and applied persistence. He keeps on reminding us, doesn't he, of the requirements. Sometimes I have to admit, I feel burdened by the requirements. There seem to be so many of them, and so meticulously presented, so presented in organized form. And often, it seems to me, difficult to fulfill. But, again, what man has done, man can do. The willingness to work through these groups exists on our side and is found, therefore, upon the inner planes. Well, may we say that's encouraging, of course. They persist, going on with text. The providing of an adequate instrument through which we can work must come from you. Well, there's a division of responsibility here. We know that behind us are the great beings who know what is to be done, how to do it, when to do it, the pitfalls, the dangers, the possibilities. But what must we do to provide the adequate instrument? And we've seen that kindness and love and goodwill and harmony, and of course intelligent study and deep meditation, and the right motive to serve, all these are required. And then the Tibetan and other masters who are undertaking such seed group experiments will have their groups to work with. It will be interesting someday to learn the nature of these other groups. But we certainly do have enough to handle right now with our own groups. So DK goes on. The time must come, however, when the work of each seed group of disciples must definitely integrate. I think, may I say, this is what he was striving for. And thus, he goes on to say, thus change from the theoretical and experimental to the definite and the practical. And that I've sometimes said, back in arcane school days, there came a point in the studies where they basically said, or the lessons said, you've got enough theory, and you've studied many things. Now, now let's make it practical. And without doing that, well, I wrote one of my friends and I said, well, I think you're better on the physical plane than I am. Sometimes I feel like I'm hanging out on the mental plane with my feet dangling down below, trying to at least make contact. But Yeah, we've got to make an impact right here on the physical plane, and sometimes I think, well, maybe the University of the Seven Rays and the Seven Ray Institute and the Moria Federation, maybe they have made an impact through classes and through various kinds of broadcasts and conferences and things of that nature. Naturally, one would like to see a greater impact because, as DK says, well, maybe he's speaking of himself, he says, we're never satisfied with what we've done. On my own lower turn of the spiral, that's how I often feel, never satisfied with what I've done. But going on with DK, then the period of group usefulness will arrive. And this will be dependent upon two things. But remember, we're not quite yet at the point of group usefulness. That's coming, and I do have high hopes for the continuation of the C group process. But group usefulness will depend upon, one, when the group reaches a certain stage of synthesis, then it will become possible for the group to work as a group with power. Now, may I say, maybe first comes unification, and then comes synthesis, if he means them in their usual progressive sense. Right now, it's not a bunch of individuals interested in themselves who will make the grade. Group synthesis. Group synthesis. Are we achieving that? And then number two, if the group fails to integrate and to take advantage of group opportunity and the particular call to service, then a rearrangement of the personnel will be essential. Now, may I say, I do believe that that did happen in a few cases. The people invited, well, you know, not all of them were on the second ray or the first. And some of them, surprisingly, on the seventh ray, did not make the grade. Maybe both of them, I think there were two disciples on the seventh ray in terms of their soul. Well, later, of course, he had to call the attention given to the groups of 9 into suspension for a while, because the whole issue of the Great War was imminent and threatened basically the persistence of humanity. So first things first, you know, they're naturally going to meet the emergency. And when he reformulated his groups as a group of 24 and maybe a group of 14 studying different things, some of those in the groups of 9 were not invited. Because he said, well, X, Y, or Z had reached his high water mark. So then the Tibetan goes on to say, certain disciples will then have to drop out, and may I add, it would be temporary. It would just be dropping out of the immediate process and going on. Those who have not measured up to the requirements. Notice that word, measure up. It sort of suggests an augmentation of stature. You know how kids are always going to the doorway and taking a pencil and measuring how tall they are now, and a few months later, how tall they are then, and ongoingly. Measuring up. Certain disciples will then have to drop out, and those who have not measured up to the requirements which their souls have set for them, he's not just talking about himself now, and to the point of attainment towards which I am expectantly looking. Well, I take it back. He does include himself, definitely. To the point of attainment towards which I am expectantly looking, I might say with hope that it will be reached. They, going on, will be absorbed into other groups or form the nucleus of a reorganized unit. Well, maybe some of the specifics about that lie ahead for our consideration in Discipleship in the New Age Volume 2. Of course, I'd like to be able to go through the instructions of every disciple. It's just not possible, given the time that I have, and some really good work is being done by BL and Elena and Nicholas and Jeffrey, and maybe Philip's in on that too. Some very good esoteric astrologers working on the actual letters themselves. What I'm working on right now has to do with general advice to all the members of those previous groups and then reorganized groups. So the soul sets the target and also the master has something to do with expectations. Sometimes when we do that glamour meditation, we realize that both the angel of the presence and the master are contributing to the success of the triangle's work, as well as the projection of the monad as the jewel in the lotus on the higher mental plane. So, sorry, DK is talking about group usefulness. Synthesis is required, and a measuring up and a careful assessment of who has made the grade and is therefore not a drag upon the intended objectives of the group. Now, the last paragraph from Decay, all the teaching on the groups of disciples functioning in the New Age is intended for all the groups and for general distribution later on. Well, the 4 in India, the 2 in China. I mean, there are a number of groups that have emerged or will be emerging who apparently can benefit from the ideas being telepathically sent forth by one of the principal designated contact individuals of the hierarchy. In this case, the Master Decay. So certainly every group will have teaching, but let's look at Decay's groups alone. They will all have their specific teaching, and all of them can benefit from what is said to every one. And thus, may I say, we have and we read telepathy and the etheric vehicle for one of the groups, and glamour, a world problem, for another, and esoteric healing, a mammoth book, for another, and education in the New Age for another, and esoteric psychology for another, and a treatise on white magic for another. There are a few in there that no specific books have been written for. They weren't even organized yet, but scattered throughout the books is requisite teaching, which informs the members of the group what they must know. He goes on to say, or maybe to conclude, the teaching upon specific group work will be given up to the point where conscious use of it can be made, and the knowledge given can be turned to practical purpose in world service. Well, let us say not everything is given, but enough is given to serve practically under the purpose which is represented by the plan. And, he says, and my brothers, it is a world service that today is needed. And there are no deviations from that. It's 90 years later, maybe, between 85 and 90 years later right now. And it is a world service that is needed. And all of us, I hope and imagine, will be inspired by that powerful thought. Master Decay, he knows when to emphasize and to bring to us a memorable moment with his words, but which represent ideas which he's trying to impress us with. They represent ideas behind the words. So we've made it, friends, to page 74, and we've gone from there we go. From page 68 to 74. And this has been program number 30, and we have reached section 8 in Discipleship of the New Age, volume 1, section 1, part 7 now, and we've gone as far as part 8, and this has been the 17th of August, and well, here at least it goes on to the 18th, because it is now past midnight in Finland. So let me transfer this down. Oh, it's such valuable material, no? Would we not say? So here we go with program number 30 and section 7 and 68 to 74. And we will be beginning, when we can, with program 31, and that will be the same in all respects, except that it will be part 8. And I'll just be modest here, and I won't let my eagerness run away with me, and I'll just say, we'll take this again. XX will begin. I've been told the temple will be, I'm working in the temple, will be cleaned tomorrow and brought into greater order, and probably I won't be able to do much here. We'll see. So, friends, love and many blessings from Tui and myself, and from the members of the communication team, Biel and Joe and Michael, Stacy and Mikhail Crow, and Bob Basil's always in there, and others who have Rodrigo accompanied us in this effort to bring to you the treasures of the ageless wisdom in a way that induces deeper understanding. Okay, that'll be it for right now. And tomorrow we have at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, it won't make much sense for you, because you may be reading this at a completely different time, but it'll be either the science of triangles or the normal triangles work, as we do every Wednesday with the Ask programs. Okay. Lots of love, many blessings. We'll see you before long.